Thank you, thank you. So in brief, I am Dr. Joshi. I'm the only child psychiatrist. I think I'm the only psychiatrist speaking here in this conference, probably, yes. How many clinicians are here in this crowd? Oh, great. And how many therapists? Wow, that's wonderful. And a lot of parents, I assume, right? Yes. So what I do is that I run a clinic on autism spectrum disorder in the pediatric psychopharmacology unit at MGH. And what we cater services to are the folks with either they have presumed diagnosis or they have established diagnosis of high-functioning autism spectrum, and if they have any psychopathological, behavioral, emotional difficulties. In this process, when I'm sitting as a clinician, I'm thinking as a researcher to understand the high-functioning spectrum better in the population. And when I'm looking at the data and research, I'm trying to understand how this data translates into those behavioral symptoms and how can we harness this data to benefit the patients with high-functioning spectrum. I think the greatest challenge we have is in identifying high-functioning spectrum. I think it's highly under-recognized. As clinicians, we always say that there is always another case to be recognized, an undiagnosed spectrum in your practice which you're not aware of. Now, the issue with the high functioning is that the presentation of the high functioning spectrum is highly heterogeneous as the audience here tonight. I mean, it is so heterogeneous that you cannot use one template of understanding the disorder to diagnose and treat them. So what we basically focus on, and I've got these features here of autism spectrum, you all are aware of it, I'm not going to go in detail, but we focus on the traits. And we identify the traits and then see how the traits interact with the psychopathologies and how can we understand psychopathology in the context of those traits and treat the psychopathology as well as try and treat the traits. For example, if you think of high-functioning spectrum, and as Dr. Menon mentioned earlier too, is that their presentation with the nonverbal communication, if you look at the tone of voice or the body language, in the classic autism, they may not understand any tone, high intensity or low intensity. If you show extreme anger, extreme happiness, or extreme anxiety, they may not understand that. Neither will they understand the subtle variations of tone and of facial expressions showing a lower, medium, or low intensity of nonverbal communication. We looked into our clinic population, and we recognized that if you look at this graph here, I can't use the pointer. Forget it. So if you look at the errors they make, the high-functioning spectrum, it's not that they're not making eye contact. Most of the time, the high-functioning spectrum does make eye contact, but they don't read faces. Whereas the low-functioning probably doesn't even make eye contact. Even when they make eye contact, they may read the high-intensity emotions very well. Extreme happiness, extreme anger, tears falling down. Once they see the objective tears coming down the eyes, then they understand somebody is sad or depressed. But they don't read the subtle ones. And unfortunately, as you get older, most of the nonverbal communication is the low-intensity nonverbal communication, and it's highly impairing. So they are legally blind to nonverbal communication as they reach their adulthood. So one way we try to understand autism is in a very simplistic way. If you look at the intelligence, and intelligence is not, you're not globally intelligent or you're not globally deficit. It has different aspects of intelligence, and if you have the intellectual intelligence, which all of us know that it's always tested in school, and you get the grades. So you know what the intellectual intelligence is like. Then comes the social emotional intelligence. Nobody grades this. This is not graded in schools at all. And one of the things we're trying to do in the local school is trying to figure out ways to grade social emotional intelligence so that if we see someone lagging behind, one can sort of start educating them and helping them, facilitating their social emotional processing and interactions. That social emotional intelligence, if it is impaired, then depending on the intellectual intelligence, if the intellectual intelligence is intact, it becomes high-functioning spectrum. If the intellectual intelligence is relatively better than the social emotional intelligence, it's the low-functioning autism spectrum. Otherwise, if both the areas are impaired, it's a global intellectual disability. We all know that. Now, when we say high-functioning autism spectrum, it's really not high-functioning, actually. It's just that their intellectual intelligence is not impaired. They are still, may have an average intelligence or a little below that, but that does not mean they're really, truly higher functioning than the typicals. Now, we know that the prevalence of autism this is the data from US, and I'm sure it replicates other places too, is on the rise. And it has really gone twice the prevalence what was 10 years ago, and is still on an increase. Now, there could be many different reasons for it, but what we see in our clinics is that the major reason is a large population of not recognized autism, and usually it's the high-functioning spectrum. Most of the time, we see the kids in our clinic, and because it's across the lifespan, when we are assessing the kids, the apple never falls too far from the tree. It's either one of the parent does carry the heavy traits, may not be as impairing as the child, and they are intellectually functioning well. Most of them are either at MIT or some biotech company, but socially they are equally impaired. I remember a father coming from MIT to me, and he was working in a lab there, and his daughter, I'm seeing the daughter, she has ADHD, and I'm saying there has to be something more to it. So I started taking history from the parents. By the way, I always take history from the parents of their early development, and I try to assess their social and emotional development, because that gives us a roadmap of how far the child is going to go if they carry the same traits. So father got very upset with me at one point and says, hey, look, who cares about socialization? I'm too busy with my work. I have no time to socialize. We all know that if we really want, if we have the motivation to do something, if we have the desire, we carve out time for it. It's the mother who said to me, oh, by the way, our babysitter tells us that there's something off in the child in terms of socialization, that she has parallel play, that she doesn't play with the babysitter. So it is a highly prevalent disorder, and we have roughly 30% of our population as adults with high-functioning spectrum. These are the cases. I mean, the oldest one I have diagnosed at the age of 54. One would say, how does it help? And I say, if you're colorblind, wouldn't you like to know that you are? And in some ways, it's a relief for the families. On the other hand, because they are very concrete as a patient or as a family, they try to take the diagnosis as a concrete black and white evidence, and then they run with the diagnosis, and everywhere they keep shouting, oh, I did this wrong because I have autism. So it's important to give them a richness of what kind of autism the child suffers from. This prevalence, there was this famous South Korean study done, and they did in regular school and some of these special education settings, and they used the most stringent criteria for autism, ADR and ADOS, and they found the highest rates of autism in that school setting in South Korea. Even though the rates were high, these kids were performing relatively well in school. They didn't have any impairment. Because I think the impairment with autism, as we say, it's relative. In absolute terms, you may have autism, but in relative terms, you may not have the impairment, because every genetic pool in the world has its own social expectations and social competence. Without naming the genetic pool, there are genetic pools which are not socially well driven. They are not into socialization. They have a lot of the social norms algorithmized or operationalized. I can talk about Britishers because we were ruled by them. We know a little bit about them. That they have all their rules. They have a rule how to bow in front, how many times you shake the hand, and you shake it 3 times, not 2, not 4. So sometimes these genetic pools, with their genetic vulnerabilities, they come up with ways to overcome them so that the societies can be together. When these folks from one genetic pool, where they may be relatively not impaired, but have the absolute impairment in autism with deficits, if they are thrown in, say the British folks are thrown into an Italian family, can you imagine what's going to happen? They are open, they don't have boundaries, they're very fluid in their interaction, they're very rich in their interaction. The same person who looks very astute and very sort of has a very calm face, has tight upper lip, and very stiff, in that setting, you will notice that they're not performing well, and then their deficits show. So I think the autism deficits, depending on the genetic pools, expresses itself. And in one genetic pool, they may have the autism deficit, but it may not express as impairment. Because I can talk about my culture. I remember I was very good in playing cricket, and I wanted to play the state level. And my mother pulled my ear, told me, just sit and study. You're not going to do this. Because I think in our genetic pool, education is paramount. And so that becomes the most lauded thing when the kids become teenage years. So if you see this rise in the rates of autism, the rates of autism in the low-functioning population, they are relatively stable. They haven't shifted. What has really shifted are the rates in the high-functioning population. So a lot of the increase in the rates are contributed by recognition of high-functioning spectrum in populations. In the US, probably we can say globally. Now, the diagnosis, and we all know it, early diagnosis is essential here. And even when we say in the classic autism, if they're diagnosed by the age of 4, it's a little too late. And the broader the spectrum is, the later the diagnosis is. If you have intellectual functioning intact, the diagnosis is further later by the age of 6 years or 7 years of age. So one of the challenges in autism research and in practice is to recognize autism as early as possible. And remember this, I'm setting the stage to show something later on as a data which can sort of help identify these kids with autism spectrum. In terms of the age ranges, by what time they are recognized, by the age of 8 or 9 years of age, 70% of the folks with autism are recognized. But there are these 1/4 of them which are not recognized, and oftentimes they have psychopathologies. They have ADHD, they have anxiety, they have mood dysregulation, and most probably that overshadows the traits or symptom and presentation of autism, and they are the ones who remain unrecognized by the age of 9 or 10. So that's pretty late. As a clinician, I can tell you, we see autism most of the time which has not been recognized, and when we treat their psychopathologies, then these sort of social deficits surface. And if we are not mindful, and if we attribute those social deficits to the disorder in hand we are treating, we may end up over-medicating these children or over-targeting that treatment for that disorder and not focus on the autism. So it is a highly under-recognized condition, especially in our clinic settings. Okay, so this is one of the cartoons I make, and I show it to the families because it helps them to understand. And what I'd say that, we're all born autistic, to be a little dramatic about this. Babies, in every culture, when you see a baby, you over-exaggerate your emotions. Baby! And this is across the cultures. Go see any culture. It is so innate in us. We do that because babies cannot probably read subtle nonverbal, so they only react to the very extreme nonverbal. So they don't have very fine-tuned nonverbal abilities. They have no empathy. They'll cry their lungs out all night. They're demanding, to the point it's like an addiction. The baby cries all night, and you wake up in the morning, you kiss the baby the first thing. So they are non-empathic. They are very rigid with their routines and structure, right? They have no introspective abilities. So these babies, and yet one thing is very interesting about them. They can still express emotions. Nobody's ever in a doubt when baby is angry or crying or happy because they show extreme of the emotions. And interestingly, I think the emotions don't travel through the structural language. They travel through tone, they travel through body language, they travel through touch. They're the most profound ways of communicating emotions. And if the non-moral communication is poor, you have a deficit in expressing or letting others know what you're feeling. One of the questions I ask my patients is, tell me, how do you express affection? How do you show affection? And oftentimes they're dumbfounded. Either they will write 3 pages of essay, or they'll write 20 points of why they love their mother. But that's the only way that they don't know how to hug, how to cuddle, how to sort of express those emotionality. So babies, in a sense, are extremely good in expressing the emotions. The language plays a fundamental role, and so I would say a clinician from another country, another language, may not do a good job of sort of helping kids with spectrum in a different culture and language, because language innately, if you don't know the culture of the language, it's very hard for you to understand the social norms and how cultures work, and how to understand what are the rules of that particular culture. In my family, I never learned my native tongue. The reason was my parents would always use it when they would fight. It seemed like it ran with the emotions. The extreme emotion brought in the native language, otherwise it wasn't there. Unfortunately, they didn't fight too often. So I didn't get a chance to learn my native language, which you then miss, that there's another way of connecting and relating to your culture. So everybody's born autistic, then they start growing. So that even if you may have social deficits, it doesn't sort of separate out from the typicals till the age of 4 or 5. Because at the age of 4, if I ask you, which of these two babies is a math genius, you won't be able to tell that. You will only be able to tell that once the babies start going into school and they start sort of learning math. So the social deficits, even if they have it, they don't express themselves. And I can tell you one thing. So I have a set of high-functioning spectrum kids, folks who are diagnosed when they had gone past college. And moving past college is one of the most vulnerable times they have. Why? Because till college, everything is very algorithmic. The track is made, the report cards are clear, you know what you're getting. But once you reach the delta, where you have to figure out your own way after the river has flown, you just feel lost. I have seen the video recording of these 8 or 9 kids who I have in their early childhood. There were not very clear signs of autism at the time. The eye contact wasn't that bad. In fact, in 2 kids I found as they got older, the eye contact became worse. So there is a regressive kind. So what I'm trying to say is that we do know that there is one way of presentation of autism, but there are many different tributaries of autism, how autism can express. Fundamentally, in the end of the day, they have social emotional deficits. So it's by the age of 8 or 9, they start separating these kids. From that is, what happens is that the typicals start racing ahead in their social development. And now the kids, their interests change, their nonverbal communication becomes more prominent. They are subtle, mostly negative, and these kids being blind, they're bullied and harassed, and that's how the separation starts showing up. It is at that point, with their emotional behavioral difficulties, these kids do tend to show up in our clinics. So this is one of the mental health disorders showing where is the maximum disability you see in their lifetime with disorders. And interestingly, autism is in a strange color there in light orange. The peak time of the disability is usually the teenage years. I think the teenage years are the roughest years for high-functioning spectrum kids. And if they go past that, there's a lot of hope. So I always try to show them the future. I say, when you will hit the industrial age, and when you're done your college at MIT and other places or for area of proficiency, your time will come, and they need hope. And this is one thing I always remind them. This is your toughest time, because the skill set needed to go past this developmental phase, you don't have it. But the skill set you have will be very productive in the next phase of life. So these are the kids between the ages of 8 and 17 show in our clinics. And most of the data which I'm going to share today is from that age range, 8 to 17 years. In our own clinic, we did a survey of autism traits, and on a scale called SRS, we looked at how many were case positives, and we found 33% of the kids had enough autistic traits to say that there was disability because of autistic traits. Not that they had the diagnosis, they had the traits. Yet only one clinician as a differential wrote in the end could be PDD. So it's highly, highly under-recognized disorder. In our clinic, we've been always collecting data on the psychopathologies over the years. And one of the modules we created was for autism, because there's no module for autism in the instrument we use for assessing psychopathologies. We found that roughly 10% of the kids coming into the clinics had autism as a diagnosis. So it's more prevalent in clinic setting than in general setting. It's being highly heterogeneous, and Dr. Vinod Menon mentioned about the resting state. Do you know which organ in our body consumes maximum energy? Not you, Dr. Menon. Anybody else? It's the brain. And do you know when it consumes the maximum energy? While you do nothing. When you just sit. So whenever your wife complains and say you do nothing, you tell them, no, my brain is working pretty hard right now, right? So in that, you have these different networks, and one of the networks which is most active at that time is default mode. It's an introspective network. And we found that that network in autism, and I'm not going to go into the details here, shows that network in red was weak. And the task-positive networks were also connecting with the default mode network, and they were also active at the time when the default mode network was active. In fact, the task-positive networks are suppressed during the time when default is active. So there is an aberration there. More importantly, I mean, these are theoretical aspects. What we always talk about the means and how did the group do against each other, healthy control and autism. But if you look at the individual values, you see the values are all over the place. They're as heterogeneous as the disorder is. And so when you look at, is something called clustering you can do, and you can cluster. The circles are healthy control, the triangles are autism, and they are showing different patterns of deficits clustering together. And the color of the cluster shows that the patterns are similar to each other. You see a very distinct cluster in the orange, which are all healthy controls, one cluster. You see, on the other hand, and the yellow triangles, all autism. And in the middle is a cluster, which is like in the green, which has autism plus healthy controls. Seems like there is a spectrum here. And that is why it's called a spectrum disorder. If you look at the general population, and if I throw in an autism screener to this crowd, I can tell you nobody's come out zero. Everybody will have some traits. And it is the degree of the traits you have, and because psychiatry has no other way of doing it, if you have impairment, then they become autism if you have all traits. So nobody is spared. Nobody is all or none in autism, which makes the research a little bit complicated. But actually, the same pattern is reflected in the findings here. That you see a healthy control, you see autism-affected folks, and in the middle is a mixture of autism and healthy control. There is something called, in machine learning, which Dr. Menon mentioned about, is a minimum spanning tree. What you do is one network, and here the network is in blue, which is called the default mode, that network should connect with itself the most strongly. And then the other network, which is the opposite one, is the task-positive network in yellow and deeper yellow. That network should have its own binding first before it binds with some other network. So in a classic way, I would like you to see the first one there on the extreme right side of me. Is like a nice necklace. You see the blues, that is all default mode network, and the yellows are the task-positive network, and the task-positive network connects with the default mode, but it is not in the default mode. So that is something visually we thought, okay, so this is how we would expect in typicals, which most of the typicals had. This on the right side are the typicals. On the left are the ASD. And in the ASD, you see that the task-positive networks are lighted up at the same time when the default mode is lighted, and they are actually connected with the default mode network, which classically they're not supposed to be. A majority of them, 10 out of 15 in the autism folks, had that kind of aberration where the task-positive and the default were connected together. So this is one way of sort of figuring out what kind of brain abnormalities are present with autism. The other work we're doing in these teenagers is looking at the glutamate activity in a region of the brain which is right in the center here called anterior cingulate cortex, the dorsal part of it, which is the hub where the input comes from the prefrontal side of the brain and from the limbic, and the product of that interaction is how you react. Now, the glutamate activity, what we found in autism folks was was very high. Sorry, did we move to the next? Yeah, was very high. The right side is ASD, higher than the healthy controls. Yet you look at the spread. I mean, there's a huge spread there of the findings, right? And it correlated with the autism severity. So the more the severe the autism was, the higher the glutamate activity was. Now, this is not very specific. In other disorders too, you see a higher glutamate activity, but the amount, the robustness of the highness of the glutamate activity was threefold higher than what we see in ADHD or in anxiety. Okay, we move on to this. We then did the same thing, what we did in the clustering. We put the glutamate levels in the blue are the glutamate levels in healthy control, and in the orange are the glutamate levels in the ASDs. And you see a pattern, and when you plot them just by their levels, you see there is a clear-cut healthy control region till 6, and then there is a clear-cut autism region, and there is a vast overlay of the glutamate activity between the healthy controls and the autism folks. So it just shows you the same kind of spread as we showed in the resting state data. One of the things with autism is that we did a study looking at their driving behaviors. We wanted to see how do they drive, and we found a very strange pattern with autism. First of all, most of the autism folks don't want to drive, and don't push them to drive, because they innately know that there's something they cannot do. What we found that we put them in a kind of a closed environment with a screen and a car and we have biological sensors on them and eye tracking, and we found that they were driving, scanning not only the road, not only the other lanes, but also the sidewalks. So their scan region was way wider. So if you have to scan wider region, that means you can't remain focused on where you need to. Moreover, they were often looking up higher than where typically people would see. So if people typically see other drivers, they were looking up nearly at the sky, half car. So they were more prone to accidents. And whenever they were distracted by any mobile call or something, they started looking at the median of the road. So this is something we're trying to study, that the driving behaviors, and if we gain enough knowledge of what the deficits are, and these are all with driver's license in US. So they have got the license, but they have this kind of unusual pattern of scanning and monitoring the road. They have a lot of psychopathologies with autism. Now, two issues I'll quickly touch because the time is running out here. One is ADHD. Historically, they thought ADHD cannot be part of autism because they hyperfocus. Actually, typical ADHD also hyperfocuses on their preferred activity. If you have a typical child with ADHD, when they're playing video games, they're not distracted at that time. They're hyper-focused. You keep calling their name, as Dr. Menon was saying. They are not going to listen to you because they are too focused on their video games. So in autism, if they're too focused on their preferred activity, it does not rule out ADHD. And now they have included in DSM-5 ADHD as a disorder comorbid with autism. The other one is anxiety, and this is a tricky one. Because these are folks, because the facial expressions are not there, they don't show anxiety the way typical show. These folks, their faces will be flat. They oftentimes come across arrogant when they may be extremely anxious. And when you shake their hand, you'll find them sweaty. You'll see chapped lips, that they're smacking their lips. Dry mouth is one of the complaints. When you look at the blood work, sometimes it shows washout of CO2 because they hyperventilate. So their anxiety is very atypical. It's a good idea to address their anxiety, not in a typical way, but to look at biological markers of anxiety. And I can talk more about it after the talk if anybody's interested in knowing how to assess anxiety in autism. Good news is, and a bad news is, right here, is if you look at the onset of disorders, psychopathologies in autism, they tend to occur earlier than typicals. Right by the age of 11 years, most of the psychopathologies show up. So the onset is earlier than typical, but good news is that after 16 years of age, if they did not develop any psychopathology, there's a rare chance that they may develop any. I mean, these are group numbers. So the psychopathology, so if you see a child at the age of 14, 15, and the parents ask, is he more prone to developing some other psychopathology? You say the chances are way less than they were before this. There's something emotional dysregulation. You know, in psychiatry, the problem is we have diagnostic categories, and these diagnostic categories don't serve us well. What typically we see these kids, because of poor executive control over their emotions, a combination of anxiety, irritability, and inattention. And this is like 83% of the population we see in our clinics show that. And if we look at the brain regions, and if we try to see autism with emotional dysregulation, we see an additional glutamate activity higher than what you see without emotional dysregulation in autism. So it reflects in glutamate activity in the brain too. I'm gonna skip this part and this part and go here because I've got 15 seconds to tell you important. So remember in the study we showed that there was a wide variation in the glutamate activity in the ACC region. What we did, we operationalized with like one standard deviation above the healthy control, we will call them high glutamate activity. And we found that 60% of the high-functioning autism as a teenagers had high glutamate activity in their DACC. Now, we gave these folks, all of them, and the 39% didn't, all of them got Memantine. It's a medication which cuts down the glutamate activity. What we found after 12 weeks of treatment in autism is that before we broke the blind, we just wanted to see, okay, all the folks who improved on autism behaviors, social behaviors, it's pretty hard to imagine how a medication can improve social behaviors, right? Well, if you think of chemicals, how many people drink here? Wine, alcohol? I'm one. None? Come on. This is not a sin. Right. Do you know how social sometimes we become when we are a little tipsy? That means chemicals do play a role in our social behaviors, right? So anybody who improved in their social behaviors in the end had a significant decrease in the glutamate activity, irrespective of being on placebo or not. So placebos do work, and they work in a real way. Anybody who didn't improve, irrespective of being on Memantine or placebo, the glutamate activity did not shift from the baseline. In the second slide, you see that folks who were on Memantine had a greater improvement in the glutamate activity than the folks who were not on Memantine. Now, what we did, that when we looked at the whole data set, we found, yes, the social behavior by definition improved on folks who took Memantine, but the improvement was not too robust compared to the placebo. But when we divided that data set into the 61% who had high glutamate in ACC versus 40% who didn't have high glutamate in ACC, we found that all the folks who improved on social behaviors on Memantine were in the high glutamate activity group. None of the folks who were on the normal glutamate activity improved in their social behaviors with Memantine treatment. So this suggests some kind of biomarker of treatment response, which we are now sort of putting together a prospective study to see if the glutamate activity in the DACC can predict the response on glutamate modulators for the treatment of social deficits in autism. These are the kind of folks I see, from very typical on one end to all different colors of young people with spectrum. And this would be, no, move. This is our group at MGH who works with me for research and clinical work in autism. Thank you.